In this video, we will talk about some important differences between oral and written language. First of all, as far as we know, every human society has oral language. In contrast, only some languages have a written form. In fact, until recently, only a few of the world's languages had a written form. Scientists believe that having an oral language is part of being human. That means that oral language has existed since the first humans appeared on the planet. In contrast, written language has only existed for a much shorter period since it was first invented in some civilizations. Another important difference is that essentially all children develop oral language to a smaller or greater extent, unless there are very severe developmental disorders preventing it. In contrast, only some children learn to read and write, and that is only those children that receive some sort of instruction to read and write, and of those children, those who manage to actually learn it. In fact, acquiring an oral language requires no explicit teaching and no particular effort to that effect. Nobody teaches their children to talk. And if someone tries to, they are wasting their time because acquiring an oral language only requires interaction within a linguistic community as part of normal human development. In contrast, written language must be taught. Some form of instruction is always necessary. For many children, this must be detailed and systematic instruction of all aspects of written language, and for other children, only some small parts need to be specifically taught and the rest are picked up. But some teaching is always necessary. Oral language seems to work in the same way in every linguistic community. That is, there are parts that bear meaning, that are words or word parts, and those are put together in specific sequences called sentences that convey a more overall meaning. In contrast, different forms of written language exist that work in very different ways. An important difference concerns the mapping that each kind of language represents. Oral language has to do with a mapping of forms, of word forms to meanings, and these mappings are essentially arbitrary. This means that words that sound very similar can have entirely different meanings within a language and, of course, between different languages. In contrast, the mappings that are essential for written language are not to meanings, but to the way words are pronounced. And these mappings, from the way words are written to how they're pronounced, are very systematic within a language. Overall, the way to characterize these differences is to say that oral language is natural in the sense that it is a part of human nature, and that having evolved to be human implies having evolved to have some sort of oral language that has these universal properties. In contrast, written language is artificial in the sense that it has been invented, it has been created by humans, and is not a part of our nature or universally present. Now, why are these differences important? In considering the role of evolution, we can see that oral language is a product of evolution along with the rest of the human nature. In contrast, written language is not something we have evolved to be able to do. Of course, the fact that written language is possible for most of us means that it does take advantage of skills and abilities that are evolved, but they are put together in a novel and complex way that makes it both in need of teaching and very difficult for some. In particular, when talking about the brain, it seems clear that some brain circuits must have evolved to support oral language. This is not possible for written language. It makes no sense to say that our brains have evolved to read and write, because reading and writing were invented long after our brains were evolved. Of course, some of the pre-existing brain circuits must be taken up for the task of reading and writing, but they are forced to coordinate in novel and complicated ways by instruction and practice. And that doesn't work for everybody, and certainly not in the exact same way. The differences also make it important to think about how language, how oral language is involved in learning to read and write, how language skills, language domains, and language mechanisms described at the brain and cognitive level are involved in learning and being a good reader afterwards. So for efficient and effective teaching of written language, we must take into account this understanding of the fundamental differences between oral and written language.